Good afternoon, and welcome to week 12. This week, we'll be learning about the self, personality, mental health, and mental illness. And in this lecture, we'll focus on the self and personality. I was pleased to see an average of 76% on the week 11 quiz. That is going to be better once I've fixed something. At 3 p.m. on a Sunday, a student emailed me to let me know that she didn't think something was working out with the bonus points. And so most of you have been marked out of 31. And when that's fixed, it has to be a manual fix. And most students had written their quizzes by then. So I won't be able to do it tomorrow, but it'll definitely happen by the time the final grades go up. Those have to be fixed to make the bonus point thing work properly. And so most of you will see an increase of about 3%, even if you didn't get the bonus question right. Because you shouldn't be responsible for getting it right. And 61% of people did get it right. Please check your feedback for the week 9 and 10 quizzes, which has now been released, and assignment 2 as well. Almost all of you should have that back by now. And please check the grading against the rubric if you think there's a concern and let me know. Now, some students, 3, have emailed me to challenge the grading key, and some of those questions have been very difficult. So in one case, the student sent me an article from the National Institute of Medicine, which I read, and then reading it, I wasn't sure what the right answer should be, and I sent it to 4 other professors and the textbook publishers, and they all said different things, and I have to sit down and read through that and make a decision. And so I'm going to take a day at the end of the course to go through those and then sort that out before the final grades are in. But that's why I haven't responded yet if you're waiting for a response from me. You did your last adaptive learning assignment last week, and so there won't be any more of those, but I was wondering, how did that go for you? Was that useful? Could I get a show of hands for yes, keep doing that with future students? Okay, that's a lot. Anyone just found that didn't work? Yeah, not a good use of time? May I ask you why? Because I'm interested.
Yeah, it felt really out of touch with the rest of the material in the class. And I kind of got a lot of repeat questions that I'd already answered, and I answered correctly too.
That was a big problem last year, and so I cut down the length dramatically, okay. So I'd be less likely to do that.
I still got a few. But...
Okay, yeah. Thank you. If you could email me that, I'll include it in a report back to the university, because there's a $50,000 contract with McGraw-Hill that is why you have that access. So if there's bugs, we need to fix them. Yes?
I find the read out loud feature on that website as well as bad, because if you scroll even a little bit, it'll just pause and you just have to keep on using this tiny little slider to go through the entire skip through material. So it's kind of frustrating if you use the read aloud
yeah, if you need it and it's not working well. Thank you for bringing that forward, and can you also email that to me so I can carry it forward? Great. Today in the lecture, I will cover the self, personality, trait, and type theories, and some common tools and methods for understanding personality. And I'll be putting these on assignment 3. This involves some theory and practice that is quite occult, and that's not going to work for students from some religious backgrounds. So you may request a religious accommodation from the Zodiac and Enneagram activities. I expect that with this housekeeping and with the assignment stuff that this lecture will go over time. However, class does end at 2:15 p.m. So if I'm not done by then, I'll just record the last 10 minutes and then send it out. So class will still end when it's supposed to end. So I want to start with a 2-minute writing exercise. So if you take out your pen and your paper or your laptop and just think about the question, who are you? Try to answer it, just sort of free flow. I'll do it too. welcome. We're doing a quick writing activity just to say who you are. So if you were to write for a minute, or even think about it, how would you answer that question? I'm giving people about another minute. For those of you on Zoom, if you type in the chat, it will be projected to the class. I just figured out how to do that. Okay, it's been 2 minutes. So how did you define yourself? Like, how did you answer that question? What kind of words might you have used? Anyone? Still working on it? Yes.
I put down my age and my gender and sexual identity.
So demographics, kind of social categories, demographics. Like, you know, I am 20 or I am 30 and I am 50, and those all mean different things. So age, gender, saying I'm a man or I'm a woman or I'm neither means a lot. Age, gender, what was the other one you said?
I also put down my sexual identity.
Okay. Other ones we commonly use are like ethnicity. Any other ones? Yes.
My values.
Your values. Wow. It's very connected. What does that sound like? What would a statement like that sound like? Like I am caring.
Yeah. What means the most to me, like family.
Awesome. So like something like I am, so it's like an I am statement, but a value could be caring. And then what would a family statement sound like?
What means the most to me?
Sorry, I can't hear you.
What means the most to me?
What means most? Okay. So like, could you say like, I am a sister, I am a daughter?
Yeah.
So that's interesting. It's defining yourself in relation to others. So it's in relation to relationships. So maybe you are, say, a daughter or a sister or an aunt. Okay, those relationships. Yes.
I said my position, like my occupation currently, so like
Occupation.
first year at SMU.
Yeah. So like occupation or career. People will say things like, I am a doctor, I am a lawyer, and then there is an identity. Anything outside of these? No.
Hobbies.
Hobbies. Sort of like, I am a baseball player.
Yeah, or like what I like to do in my spare time.
Kind of like, I am a, some kind of hobbyist. Like, I am an artist. Something like that. I'm a poet. Did we miss anything? Yes.
I put where I'm from.
Where you're from. Okay, so like location. It's also a bit about like society, national identity, like something like I am Canadian, or I am a Calgarian, or I am Haligonian. It's still about more than just physical location. There's still some social identity. It's still about culture. Welcome. We're just thinking about the ways that you can define yourself. So all of these on their own are not kind of perfect or whole definitions, because like, let's say you said, I am a student. Well, you're not always going to be a student. It is part of your identity now. And later when you're not a student, you could say, I was a student, right? It still stays part of you. It's supposed to change the slide when I do that. Sometimes it doesn't. So you've learned that psychology is the scientific study of human behavior and mental states. And now let's look at that word, psychology, and think about its etymology, where it came from. How many morphemes are in that word? Or a morpheme is a unit of meaning. Two. You say two. Two is correct. Or what? How would you parse that out into two morphemes?
Psychoanalysis.
Yeah, psychoanalysis. Okay, so we have that pen. Psychology as psych and ology. What does ology mean?
Is it like a study of something?
Exactly, a study like archaeology. Biology is the study of life or living organisms. So it's the study of. The study of. So psychology is the study of what? It's also in psychiatry. And iatros is the Greek word for healer. And so a psychiatrist is a doctor who heals your what? Psychology is the discipline that studies what?
Your mind?
Yeah, so that is one of the ways we think of the word psyche, okay? So psyche means the human soul, mind, or spirit. That's really big, isn't it? Okay. So it comes from a Greek word that means breath, life, or soul, and breath in the animating sense of life. In the ancient myth, Psyche is a beautiful young mortal woman, and she's carried off by Eros, or Cupid, who's the god of love, as in desire. And this is an illicit relationship, and she betrays him, and he's an angry, insulted god. She's sorry, and she wants to redeem herself. So she's given 4 impossible tasks by his mom, who doesn't like her. That was Aphrodite or Venus. And Aphrodite even has her handmaids, Worry and Sadness, torture Psyche. So the tortured Psyche is given 4 impossible tasks. She has to sort a basket of mixed grains overnight, gather wool from a herd of vicious sheep, and even go down into the underworld to get a favor from the queen of hell. And every time she thinks she can't do it, she's overwhelmed. And every time she tries it anyway, and she finds her allies, and they figure it out and get through the ordeal. An empathetic ant colony helps her sort through the grain, but like the birds and the mice in Cinderella, someone advises her to wait for the flock of sheep to leave and then pick up the wool that got caught on the bushes. In the end, she screws it up. She's not allowed to look into that box that was given to her by Queen of Hell, Persephone, but she does anyway, okay? And well, she did such a good job. Like, I mean, she put in such a good effort that she's ultimately redeemed through her trials. So Eros forgives her, and the gods take pity on her, and they give her the drink of ambrosia, which makes her immortal. So now she's a goddess. She's equal to Eros. And since they are both gods, they can get married legitimately. So the relationship's not against the rules anymore. all the Olympian gods attend the banquet and they're all in harmony. Usually they're bickering and there's lots of drama, but not this time. So Liber, who's the god of wine, serves the finest wine to the guest. And Vulcan, who's the god of fire, cooks the food. The muses play beautiful music. They all sit in the right places. All is as it should be, okay? There is harmony, the conflict is resolved, everything is in order, and the once illicit union is now legitimate. Eros and Psyche live happily ever after, and they have a daughter named Hedone, sort of the word hedonic, and that means pleasure, enjoyment, delight. In ancient Greek mythology, Psyche is the goddess of the soul, and to the Romans, her name was Anima, and anima is the Latin word for soul and mind, and they did not distinguish the two. So psychology is a crossover discipline between philosophy and biology. Biologically, it's obvious that you are an individual animal and your personal experience is happening inside your brain. We can get very philosophical about what a self is, right? All these different ways that you can define who you are, okay? And you were you when you were a baby with no self-awareness. You didn't know any of those things. You didn't have language. And you'll still be you when you're 90, but you won't look the same. And you might have different interests and views. So there's a you that endures all those changes. It even transcends them. There's a you that's aware of yourself, of your feelings, and of your thoughts and your environment. And that you is the only you that has ever been, or will be, out of billions of people. So your ideas about yourself are your self-concept. Self-efficacy refers to your sense of competence on a task or bunch of tasks. If you feel like you're really good at school, then you have high academic self-efficacy. I have low driving self-efficacy, legitimately, because I'm a bad driver. Okay, it's about how well you do stuff. Now, self-esteem is about your feeling of self-worth. And high self-esteem does correlate with happiness, with persistence at difficult tasks, and with less pressure to conform. But the direction of the correlation isn't clear. Like, let's say that you are successful in your work. Does that give you high self-esteem? Or is it that you have high self-esteem, therefore you perform better because of that? Or is there some kind of a bidirectional influence? There might be different kinds of self-esteem. In your book, they talk about defensive self-esteem and secure self-esteem. Maybe defensive self-esteem is fragile, threatened by failure or criticism, vulnerable to threats, defeat anger and feelings of vulnerability. Maybe that's connected to narcissism. Then they have an idea of secure self-esteem, one that's less fragile, less contingent on what other people think or say about you. And they say that people who have higher secure self-esteem achieve a greater quality of life. Self-esteem is an interesting concept. I have a question for you. Does this cat have sufficiently high self-esteem? Does it? What do you think?
It depends on the task, I guess. I feel because if we're just talking about eating or something, it's sort of just built into their instincts.
It just goes for the bowl. So it doesn't matter what it thinks.
Yeah.
It's kind of irrelevant. But that cat hasn't read any self-help books. And the cat is probably, as you just suggested, like not really thinking about it. So imagine somebody who's walking to class and he has a spring in his step. He might be in the moment, paying attention to his environment, the other people in it. He might be thinking about lunch. But then if you imagine somebody kind of walking to class like this, right? What's going on in that person's head? I've embarrassed myself. I'll never live this one down. Why do I have to mess up everything? I'm a failure. He might be running an elaborate constructed narrative about self-worthlessness. And so Randy Paterson argues that self-esteem is like a wellspring. Maybe it's not something that you need to prop up, but something that you could plug up with self-loathing. And Randy Paterson, who wrote the book on How to Be Miserable, once compared the concept of self-esteem to a virus that escaped from a psychology laboratory. The first psychologist to challenge the ethics of the idea of self-esteem, but at the idea of self-worth, okay? How do you measure the worth of a person? Start playing some game of some people are better than others for some reason. You are not good enough. Somebody is not good enough for some reason. What reason? What's a good reason? Is it achievement? Right? So you have low self-worth because you haven't achieved enough. So what does that mean? Does that mean that people are worth what they produce? Is it appearance? Say you have low self-esteem, so you say, I'm ugly. I'm so ugly. Nobody will ever love me because I'm ugly. Well, then what does that mean? People are worth how good they look. Is it being accepted by others? Well, then by whom? Is it being obedient? Well, then to what? Okay, like, are we saying that people are worth less if they're poor, if they struggle, if they're sad, if they make mistakes, if they don't conform to some narrative of success? There's a lot of shackles there. There's a lot of judgment, and there's a lot of shame, right, of self, and by extension, others. So one way out of this self-esteem problem, it's an escape route, is to instead construct people as having inherent worth. And we could talk about what behaviors are adaptive or maladaptive in a given context, given certain goals. You think about how our behaviors impact others, whether that impact is helpful or harmful. It's almost not necessary to go into some of that other baggage. There's some risks to self-esteem. If we have very high self-esteem, we might be overlooking our limitations, and it is adaptive to know those. If we're very optimistic, we might underestimate risks. Okay, that can be self-defeating when you're dealing with temptations. You might think, well, I'll try this drug and, I'm not going to get addicted. That's not going to happen to me. It can happen to other people, but not to me. Guess what's likely to happen? Okay. We already come programmed with self-serving biases, right? To prefer our own groups, okay? To perceive ourselves favorably and above average. Right? We tend to accept personal responsibility for successes rather than failures. And that can underlie a range of conflicts, like when we blame other people and we don't see how we contributed to the situation. So is the answer boosting people's self-esteem, or is there more to be said for cultivating humility? The ancient Greeks also had a myth about a young man named Narcissus. He was very good looking, but not very nice. And the vengeful Aphrodite punishes him. So one day, when he's drinking water from a pool, he falls in love with his own reflection. I mean, he can't tear himself away. He can't stop looking at it, stops eating and drinking, and he dies. And in place of his body, a beautiful gold and white flower sprang up, but it's doomed to look at itself forever. The character of Narcissus is the origin of the term narcissism. And as a personality disorder, narcissism is marked by grandiosity, an excessive need for attention and admiration, and an inability to empathize. Narcissists can be very tricky to work with or live with, because if you threaten their ego, and that can be easily done, they might take it on themselves to punish you for that. And since they're above the rules, that might be in ways that you weren't expecting. So you might deal with undermining, let's say somebody might spread malicious gossip, and those rules might not be what is expected in normal human engagement when people are trying to be decent. And that can look like emotional abuse, gaslighting, manipulation. Book talks about secure self-esteem, and that sounds a bit more like self-acceptance or self-respect. Might be self-love, but with the word love used appropriately. Has anyone seen this? Know what that interview is of? No, I posted on Brightspace because it's a really good model of secure self-esteem. So in this interview, Dolly Parton's interviewed by Barbara Walters. And Barbara Walters is a classy lady. And she asked Dolly questions that are, well, they're really classist. But she asked them in that sort of polite, indirect way. What does she say? Well, you know, she asks Dolly if, you know, her people are hillbillies, if she thinks that she's a joke, and, you know, you don't have to dress like that. It's very patronizing. It's very sort of polite in an actually very rude way. And Dolly handles it really, really well in a way that she answers the questions in a way that shows self-respect. So if you're interested, that's on Brightspace. Personality refers to a person's characteristic pattern of thinking, feeling, and acting. So characteristic pattern of behavior and of mental state. And what's key to that is it's something that's pretty stable across situations and across the lifespan. I'd expect your personality to be similar in 5 years, if I met you again, to what it is now, okay? If you're an extrovert, I'd expect that you're the kind of person that raises their hand in class, comes to talk to me. Maybe if I went to an event here, I'd see you just milling around, chatting with people, right? That would manifest consistently in the things that you do and say. And I'd expect that if I saw you again in 20 years, you'll still be an extrovert. And maybe that once upon a time, you were an outgoing child. Maybe once you were a bubbly baby. So how do we explain personality? What are people like? What are we like? The ancient Greeks and Romans thought that there were about 12 different personalities. There's like 12 different kinds of people. That's a type theory. And they believed that your personality was determined by the arrangements of the stars and planets when you're born. There's 12 of those constellations. So there's 12 different types of people. And they saw mythical beings in the patterns of the stars. And humans are very likely to do that. Our brains see patterns quite easily. So maybe a certain constellation could look like a crab or a ram, or in that case, even the scales of justice. So it said that a Libra personality is concerned with attaining balance, harmony, peace, and justice in the world. Because the Libra person was born under the influence of this big heavenly set of scales. And scales are used to determine balance and justice in the impartial weighing of evidence. There's a pattern of associations there. So when you looked at the personality description for your star sign, I'm wondering how many would have thought like that's really bang on. Like, yeah, Capricorn, that's me. And versus how many would say, no, that doesn't describe me. I'm a Virgo, and I'd say this is probably pretty good. So I'd say, sure, I'd identify with mine. Anyone else identify with theirs? Yeah? Anyone look at theirs and be like, no way? So there's more who are saying yes than no. If you approach this sort of inclined to see it as true with that openness or that trust, we would expect you to show confirmation bias and maybe a tendency to latch onto the statements that resonate with you and then ignore or disregard the ones that don't. So in my case, am I detail-oriented, critical, practical, hardworking, and analytical? Sure for all of those, but no, I'm not practical. But I'm just going to ignore that one and focus on the ones that are like, yeah, I really am into analyzing details. Good description. So what if you were to count these statements like one by one? How many are there? There's a lot. Like maybe there's 50, maybe there's 100. I started to try to count them, but I couldn't, because when I read this one, I didn't know if it's like, is the statement that you are practical, hardworking, and analytical, is that one statement that's true or false? Or is it, could you get 2 out of 3 on that? So I gave up counting pretty quickly because it was so vague. So, sorry, I had to pop up here. Now, this, I think overall is a good description of me, but I know a lot of other people who are Virgos that are not at all like this. So this describes a trait of conscientiousness. And if you're a Virgo and you have that trait, high trait conscientiousness, you might identify with this. And if you are not a Virgo, yet you have high trait conscientiousness, you might think that sounds like me. This is what's being reflected there, is the personality trait of conscientiousness. I could write a statement that's true for you because it's true for everyone. Right? Tomorrow you will breathe air. And those statements are called Barnum statements. So a statement like you have a tendency to be critical of yourself. Right? If your fortune teller says that, you might be like, oh, it's true. But that's true of everyone. I could predict a lost love will return to you. Well, what does that mean? Does it mean that you pick up a hobby that you'd set aside that you used to love? You give it another try with your ex? You found your favorite sweatshirt that you lost? It's guaranteed to be somehow eventually interpretable as true, especially if you're inclined to do so. Bertram Forer gave all his psychology students a personality test, and it looked complicated and scientific. And he said he'd do a complicated scientific analysis and then give people back their individual results. And the students were asked to rate it for accuracy out of 5, where 1 is very poor and 5 is excellent. So the students read their individualized report, and the average rating was 4.3. Like, that's doing really well for accuracy. He gave them all the same statement. Every student got that. Just because something turns out to be accurate doesn't mean that there is any valid or useful theory behind the claim. So the student's rating of 4.3 out of 5 doesn't validate the diagnostic interest bank, which was the complicated sham test he gave them at the beginning. It just happens that these Barnum statements are basically true for everyone. People do look for their star signs for guidance. Like, you go to Shoppers Drug Mart, I'm sure you can find things with your star sign written on them. Right? People ask questions like, can a Leo date a Pisces? Shoppers Drug Mart's using it to sell perfume, okay? Saying that someone with a fire sign like Leo has a fiery personality, and they have a specific scent that suits that personality. It's Mugler, Alien, Goddess, Eau de Parfum. And then they have different perfumes for their star signs. So there's a lot of this out there. Let's go back to this Virgo description. Can you see any Barnum statements in here? Anything that would be kind of true for everyone? Yes.
I was thinking probably the middle line, where it's like they invest very much of themselves into their goals and plans, but become very critical of things do not.
Great. Yeah. How many, if you get invested in a plan and it doesn't turn out the way you're expecting, a lot of people will be upset about that. That's a really good one. Yes.
They value consistency and loyalty, like who would.
Yeah, lots of people value those things. I don't know how many people like being betrayed. Another one here, happy to help anyone they love who needs it. Who do you help? People who need it that you like, not people you hate that don't need it. Okay. Then there's the Enneagram, and this one is quite popular. And an Enneagram practitioner would tell you that there's 9 types of personality, and these come to us from classical antiquity. And there's a sort of a test for that, or it's also a narrative technique where people read a description of the 9 different types and then pick the one that they identify with. And there is a very elaborate star-shaped theory behind it. And I spent some time looking into it, and all I'm going to say is that I'm not really aware of many evidence-based psychological model that naturally organize themselves into star shapes. So here's an example of the type 8, defined by the desire to be powerful and to avoid vulnerability. They present a confident, assertive, decisive image to others. 8s can be argumentative and intimidating. It's important to them to stand up for what they believe in and protect those who are weaker than themselves. They're independent, self-sufficient, fierce, confident, determined, have a lot of stamina, fiery passions and power, stubborn and headstrong, and serious about having control. Does that sound like anything else to you? Thing we've ever talked about before? This describes dominant behavior. Oh, yes.
It sounded almost exactly like the description from the perfume website.
Interesting, because they were picking the perfume website was going for this fiery, like Leo personality, and it's also got this idea of a fiery person. And one of the things you'll notice between all these different popular theories is that a lot of them, whereas the theory as a whole may be bunk, they're picking up on things that are real, like the idea that some people tend to be compliant and some people tend to be dominant. So if you've done your readings, you know that the validated psychological model of personality is the big 5, the 5 factor. And agreeableness, disagreeableness can be interpreted as having an orientation towards sort of submission, compliance, pleasing other people, being modest, whereas disagreeable people are more self-focused, know what they want, independent, they're more dominant. So if you got a type 8, you might also see a lower agreeableness score. Okay, it's not about pleasing other people. So this is very popular. It's not, the theory behind it is not scientifically credible. They will say that, practitioners will say that this comes from ancient tradition and classical antiquity, but in fact it originated in around the 1950s-ish from a Russian mystic known as George Gurdjieff, who came up with that 9-pointed figure. And then Oscar Ichazo, who's a Bolivian philosopher. He founded the Erica School. If you look at the description of the Erica School, it's a body of techniques for cosmic consciousness raising and an ideology to relate to the world in an awakened way. I went to an Enneagram workshop about a month or so, and it was interesting how it was presented. It was in a rented out chapel. So there was a very kind of spiritual feeling. The presenter, who was a psychologist, was standing behind that. And it offers, people get really, really into this stuff, and it offers a whole way to live your life. And it tells you what you need to do in order to develop spiritually and reach this higher plane of consciousness. What did you have on the board there? Path to integration, which is the goal. So I got the book, and it looks very scientific. So It's got, if you look on at the front cover, the definitive personality test and self-discovery guide. It's written by somebody with an MD from Stanford University Medical School and somebody with a PhD in psychology. And I'll read the first paragraph off the back of the book. It says that it's a centuries-old psychological system with roots in sacred tradition, and that it can be an invaluable guide in your journey towards self-understanding and self-development. In the book, Stanford University Medical School clinical professor of psychiatry, David Daniels, and counseling psychologist Virginia Price offer the only scientifically developed Enneagram test based on extensive research combined with a self-discovery and personal development guide. So there's a very strong claim that is backed by prestigious degrees and institutions. This is scientifically validated. The great thing about science is that you get to say, show me the evidence. And it's in Appendix B. It does not look really scientific. There's 2 pages of it, and it's got p-values and numbers and percentages. But I'm just gonna read you the first, well, this paragraph over here, and it's really information dense. There's a lot of jargon. And when people say things in those ways, it can sound really intellectual, and you might let it pass because it sounds like they know what they're doing. But like, let's go deeper. Okay. So they came up with these 9 paragraphs. They said, we asked representatives of each personality type. So let's say you pick one of these 9 paragraphs. You think it represents you. You say, yeah, okay, I'm a type A. Okay, all right. So we asked you to review and revise your paragraph to ensure that the paragraph is congruent with your actual experience. Okay, that sounds good. Now I get them back from you. We then reviewed their revisions to ensure that these newly revised paragraphs were accurate from a theoretical standpoint. So you give me your revisions, your corrections, and then I correct them to be back in line with my theory. It is completely circular. That is not a validation. But you might see that, right? You might glance across it, and it says Appendix B, and appendices are very scientific, and there's a PhD and an MD in Stanford. To know that it's BS, you actually have to read it. And it's hard to figure it out because you have to parse it out because there's really long sentences and really big words. So there's a few red flags for pseudoscience there. Right? There's an appeal to authority, to the Stanford University School of Medicine, and that points to the impressiveness of the person making the claim, not the actual validity of the claim. Okay? There's this stuff about ancient wisdom. There are very old ideas that are bad ones. That itself is not a proof that something's true. Pseudoscience often involves a lot of cognitive biases, things like these Barnum effects. And critically, there's often no clear mechanism of action. They might talk about sort of occult or mystical forces or energy. But what does that word mean? Like, let's say that we applied it to the idea of the zodiac. Let's say that the stars above look like this when you're born. Well, that can look like a lot of things. Maybe you could pick out this constellation. That's the middle of it there. That's the top. Okay, it's right over there. And that could look like a lot of things. But let's say it does look like a set of scales turned on its side. Okay, now how does the fact that that looks like a set of scales, what is the mechanism of action by which that's going to affect your brain development? Right, there is none. So it has to be some kind of vague force. And then pseudoscientific theories are difficult or impossible to falsify. You get predictions that are really cryptic. Things like a lost love will return to you that are pretty much guaranteed to be true. And then sometimes there's a lot of technical jargon, a lot of verbosity that sounds very sort of educated and intellectual, but is actually nonsense. Sometimes when you can't understand something, the problem isn't you. It means that it actually doesn't make sense. Okay. Now, How else can we describe people? You've seen this one before from week 6. Maybe people are like the characters in a story. So maybe a common kind of character is the caregiver, like the mother or the father. Maybe a common kind of person is the boss, the ruler, the king. It's like a dominant personality. Maybe there's some people who are intellectuals. Maybe there are some people who are explorers. So this is used in career psychology, but it's ultimately a psychodynamic personality theory. So Jung thought that there were basically 12 kinds of characters. And these are like social roles, social scripts. And you have identified some roles here, right? Occupation or career. And so like there's a social script for what is a mother like, or what is a ruler like. And we remember this one, the hero, that is the character that leaves a mark on the world through the mastery of a certain skill. Here's another one that you saw in week 6. We could describe people by their interests, by what they like to do. That's also by occupation. Right? Some people like to go read stuff in libraries, and we would say that they're investigative thinkers. And maybe some people like to tinker with toasters and car engines. We would say that they have a realistic vocational personality. Now, we got to more than 6. If you recall, you picked your top 3. So you had a code like SIA. So that works out the more than 6, but it's still kind of a type theory of personality. And it's based on the idea that at the heart of it, there's 6 core vocational personalities. Like some people like to lead, that's enterprising. Remember this one? It's another personality theory. This is the developmental one from week 4. Okay, this is Erikson's theory of psychosocial development. And Erikson theorized that your personality develops through your lifespan as you encounter and navigate certain age-related conflicts. Like, do you figure yourself out in adolescence or stay confused? Do you find your true love or end up lonely? Do you succeed in your career? Like, was it all worthwhile at the end? Erikson was an academic descendant of Sigmund Freud. And so this is a psychosocial personality model instead of a psychosexual one. So Erikson is thinking about this in terms of social conflicts, right? Like, can you find your true partner? Whereas Freud thought of everything through the lens of a personal sexuality that's in conflict with what's socially appropriate. The most famous personality theorist, maybe the most famous Western psychologist, is Sigmund Freud. Freud was sort of starting at the beginnings of psychology. It's a younger discipline in many ways than other sciences. And psychology as a science is far more soft and subjective than what we call a hard science like physics or chemistry. And when we're trying to understand human behavior, we often do it through the lens of our own personal experience, through our own positionality. We assume that other people are like us, and that's probably a great place to start. And in psychology, you'll often hear these grand narratives about the world that are presented as if there was some universal rule like gravity. But if you were to really dig into them, they turn out to be subjective, local narratives that are very culturally and historically situated, and even personally situated. So Freud believed that a normal part of psychosexual development for young men was to deal with the fact that they're attracted to their mother. What did he base that on? Yes.
And generalization of his understanding.
Yeah. So he had that issue, and he thought, wow, that was a big part of my development, and everyone else goes through that too. It's a universal. So we understand the world through our own experience, and Freud was no exception to that. And modern day psychologists still do that. I think we often do that. Freud was also very influenced by Greek mythology, and that's reflected in his theories. In the old myth, in that story of Psyche, Psyche is driven by her conflict with Eros. The story starts with illicit desire, results in these terrible conflicts, and the whole story is about how that conflict is eventually resolved. And at the end, conflict's resolved, her wishes are fulfilled, and all is right and well on Mount Olympus. Freud's psychodynamic theory of personality posits that human development and behavior is driven by these unconscious conflicts between what you animalistically want and what you are socially allowed to have, and that these need to be resolved for you to be okay. He also based his theories on his observations of his patients. Those were not a random sample of humanity. They tended to be upper-class, middle-aged Viennese women who would have been considered neurotic in their time. So you can see that there's a capacity for bias. So one, that it's based on his troubled patients in a very particular context, and one is that a lot of it's based on himself. You might talk to that same patient, have a completely different impression. So here's an example of a situation that Freud might have encountered. It's called glove anesthesia, and that's when, say, people can't, they say they can't feel their hand anymore. And that's interesting because the nerves that innervate the hand also innervate the arm. So it doesn't make sense, and they knew this back then, that someone just can't feel their hand. And he's trying to figure out why that is. And what he would figure is that maybe that is the hand that you use to pleasure yourself with, and you're so ashamed of that, but you can't admit that to yourself, that you just stop feeling your hand. Now, there could be a lot of other reasons. We know that perception is more than sensation. At some point, it's constructed in your brain. Maybe it's a pinched nerve. But he's starting somewhere at the beginning of psychology and trying to figure things out. Incidentally, people who have, like, who lose a limb can still feel it. It's called phantom limb syndrome because of their perception in their brain. There's no sensory input coming from that limb. Brains are complicated. Freud was very sex focused, and that's the reason that he came up with. So he thought that the structure of the psyche, of the mind, consisted of the id, the ego, and the superego. The ego is what's conscious. It's your conscious self. Then the id is like your moral self that knows better. And it's pre-conscious in the sense that you can access it, right? It can bubble up and be like, no, I'm not going to do that. That's wrong. And then the id is fully unconscious, and it's where all your base animalistic drives to sex and death reside. Okay, so the id operates on a pleasure principle, and it's trying to satisfy these basic drives to survive, reproduce, and aggress. One way to think about it is that it's like a shoulder devil, shoulder angel kind of situation. And the conscious self has to mediate between the two. I'd say this is not a perfect metaphor because you're supposedly unconscious of your id. So your id can't talk to you and be like, I want you to do this bad thing right now. But let's say it has some force on you. And then your ego has to mediate between wanting to do whatever that is and knowing better. And Freud would say that your mind distorts reality in order to protect itself. So in order not being able to feel your hand if that's what you were using for things that would have been seen as shameful in Freud's time, that's an ego defense mechanism. You're protecting yourself from that terrible truth by just no longer being able to feel your hand. Okay. So you don't know, this is coming from your unconscious mind. If it's unconscious, you would be aware of having the desires. So in Freud's view, if you have a dream about smoking a cigar and that's the manifest content, then that's what you know about. And then he might say that the latent content is about sexual desire. But you don't know that. Your psychoanalyst does. So Freud came up with a technique of psychoanalysis, and the person that's laying on the couch would just free associate and talk about things. And then the psychoanalyst would be thinking about what cigars in your dreams could mean. So how do you assess the unconscious if you're not conscious of it? There are projective tests. This is the Rorschach test. So a question would be, and I'll ask it to you now, what is that a picture of? And what do you see in that picture? Yes.
To me, it looks like two moths touching the hand.
That is exactly what I see. So what does that mean? Does it mean our conscious minds are the same? Like, how would we analyze that? Like, what does that mean about us that both of us see these people giving each other a high five? That it is so speculative and subjective. There's no way to check on the validity of that. Did anyone see anything else in that? Yes.
So two red thingies look like eyes, and the open area looks like a mouth, so that's almost screaming.
Oh, like a screaming mouth. Okay. And can you see how this could be dangerous? It was like, yes, and this client must be inherently aggressive because you saw a screaming mouth, right? And really, what does that mean? You saw that. It could mean so many things. Where do you go with that? It's so subjective and speculative. Here's another one. This is the thematic apperception test, or the TAT. So this is an ambiguous situation, but I could ask you, what is that a picture of? Like, what comes to mind? Yeah.
A woman mourning her dead husband.
Okay, he's died. Dark. Anyone else see anything there? My first thought was he has COVID. But then what is that's picking up something, but what is it picking up? I mean, we talk about COVID all the time. I'm getting emails from the university about it all the time. Maybe it's some exposure to information about COVID effect. You can see how tricky it is to start kind of labeling a person or treating a person based on what they might say to these things. Freud believed that there were two fundamental instincts down there in the id, one for life and one for death and destruction. He called these Eros and Thanatos. We've already met Eros, who's the ancient Greek god of love and particularly sexual desire, and there he is making off with Psyche. Thanatos is the ancient Greek personification of death. He's the son of night and darkness, and his siblings are old age, suffering, doom, deception, blame, retribution, and the guy who's the boatman of the underworld that you saw in the first picture. What a family. But he thinks that these are the two fundamental instincts. And Freud saw your driving life force as something called your libido. And he defined libido as the energy regarded as a quantitative magnitude, the amount of energy of those instincts which have to do with all that might be comprised under the word love. It's an instinctual energy or force in the id that you're unconscious of that's basically sexual. To him, it's the fundamental motivational force. And he thought that it developed through childhood. Your personality development is based on this, and it's done at puberty. So he thought that there was a series of developmental phases in which the libido fixates on different erogenous zones. So when we see a 3-month-old baby putting things in his mouth, they do a lot of that, right? Put their feet in their mouth. We might think it's because when a baby is born, first really well developed area for sensation and perception is the lips, because it has to nurse. But he's seeing that erotically, okay? And that pleasure centers on the mouth, sucking, biting, and chewing. We might say that, you know, babies who are sticking things in their mouths are doing because that's how they know things. Okay? Maybe their other sensations are not developed so well. He'd say that then it moves to the anal stage in toddlers, be exemplified by a toddler's pleasure in controlling their bowels. And then around 3 years, it moves into the phallic stage. And that's where all the boys have to cope with their incestuous sexual desire for their mother. And that's also where Freud said that girls realize a terrible truth, that they do not, in fact, have a penis. Freud thought that that was psychologically traumatic, and that girls eventually resolve this by identifying with a male figure like a father or a husband, because he has the penis, and now, you know, balance is restored. Then he sees kids going to a latency phase around from 6 years to puberty, where their sexual feelings are dormant. And he thinks that if you successfully make your way through these conflicts, then you'll have normal personality development. But let's say your mother doesn't toilet train you properly, you might get stuck in a phase. And that's where personality disorder and neurosis would result. Okay, so he also believed that the libidinal drives in the id can be in conflict with the conventions of civilized behavior in the superego. And that conflict leads to tension and disturbance in the individuals. And that's the cause of, sort of say, mental illness. So let's take a look at an unresolved stage. So in his theory, unresolved conflict at any stage can leave the person's pleasure-seeking impulse fixated or stalled at that stage. So let's say that mom underindulges the toddler's pleasure energy in toilet training, okay? And mom gives the kid a hard time and chastises them for accidents. Well, now that child develops a sense of satisfaction from control, and they develop personality traits associated with excretatory control, like being orderly and disciplined, and generally highly controlled. Freud and a lot of all these other theories are picking up on traits that we observe, and this one would be conscientiousness, a tendency to be orderly and disciplined. But he has a different explanation for it. And now let's say that mom overindulged the child during the toilet training period. You can really see that Freud had a complicated relationship with his mother. Well, then he says that the person gets satisfaction from continuing erotic pleasure in defecation. And the personality traits they get involve carelessness and disorganization, and also some things like cruelty and emotional outbursts. There's a few things in there, but one of them is low conscientiousness and carelessness and disorganization. Today, we would say that having emotional like outbursts, ups and downs would be high neuroticism. But it's kind of like he's identifying that there are certain tendencies in the population. Some people are orderly and disciplined, and he's coming up with stuff based on himself and his mom and Greek myths. You have to start somewhere. Freud's best work was probably on defense mechanisms. So he had this theory about defense mechanisms, but he also identified things that people do that look like they are protecting themselves from anxiety, right? So things like denial, there's like over 20 of them, reaction formation, projection, right? Displacement. So he has a theory about what these are, but the fact that some of these are really observable doesn't mean it proves that Freud's theory is true. So let's take dissociation. Let's say you're in this class and you're dissociated and you're thinking about something else. Is that because of some elaborate Freudian psychosexual reason that means that you're not aware of, or is it just that I'm maxed out on your attention span? Okay. But so he did make a contribution in identifying these. Like, you have met somebody in your life who is in denial, but that doesn't validate this id, ego, libido, eros, thanatos thing. So back to psychoanalysis, the point of psychoanalysis is to get the client's unresolved psychic conflicts to come into awareness, maybe through dream analysis, where they can be discerned by the psychologist, by the psychoanalyst, so that they can be resolved in healthier or more adaptive ways than what the client is already doing, which is some elaborate defense mechanism where they can't feel their hand anymore. That's the idea. Freud left quite a legacy. His intellectual descendants took psychodynamic personality theories away from that sexual stuff, more towards social conflicts. We saw that in Erikson's model of psychosocial conflict. And so who else did he inspire? Carl Jung, and that idea of there's a collective unconscious derived from our universal experiences. There's like a mother archetype and a king archetype and a hero archetype. Do those really reside in a collective unconscious, or are they social roles and scripts? There's also another common one is Alfred Adler's idea. Like, have you ever said that, notice someone behaving in a way that you think is odd and you think, wow, they have an inferiority complex. Like, they're doing that to show off. So it's easy to knock Freud, right? Development is lifelong. It's not fixed in childhood. He really overestimates the influence of parents, and he sees gender development as relying on these conflicts and relationships with the same-sex parent and the opposite-sex parent. But in fact, gender identity develops very early on. It's usually apparent by age 2, and without a same-sex parent in the home. And of course, many of his claims have no scientific support. Right? There's no Oedipus complex. Penis envy isn't really a thing. And dreams are about so much more than wish fulfillment. So his major contributions were, for one, to draw attention to the unconscious mind. We don't talk about the id anymore and eros and thanatos, but we do know that there is an unconscious mind, right? that implicit track that we've talked about in terms of learning and memory, even awareness. There are conflicts between our biological impulses and social restraints. He thought about sex at a time when polite people didn't. And sex is a powerful motivator. He talked about our fear of death, our destructive instincts, and those do affect our behavior. And he identified all those defense mechanisms. So he does have an important place in the history of psychology. Now, one of the personality tests that I sent your way is based on these psychodynamic theories. It's based on Jung's work, and Jung was an intellectual descendant of Freud. So it's the Myers-Briggs personality test. And this one is common in the workplace. They use it in the federal service, in the military. So this one comes up a lot. Did anyone take that for a spin yet? Yeah, what was your experience of that? What did you think of that?
I thought it was pretty accurate. I ended up getting campaigner, which is ENFP.
Ooh, yeah,
That
that sounds about right, doesn't it?
But I actually got turbulent ENFP, which really sounds right.
Okay, so like with the zodiac, when it makes sense to you, it's because these sort of pseudoscientific theories sometimes pick up on things that are real. So the Myers-Briggs personality type looks at 4 domains. So one of them is, are you an extrovert or an introvert? That is a thing. Extroversion versus introversion is real. Okay. Then it asks about, are you a sensor or are you an intuitor? And sensors are like the people who would get an R on the RIASEC, like to tinker with things, like to work with their hands. And then intuitives are the more sort of big ideas people, be more like your investigative types on the RIASEC. Thinkers versus feelers can reflect agreeableness, disagreeableness. There are some people who are not afraid to say the truth very bluntly when they think you need to hear it. This system would call that person a thinker. Big 5 would call that person disagreeable, because you might not like what they're going to say. Like blunt people piss people off a lot. But then a feeler, who's more sensitive, more cooperative, thinking about how others will be affected by their actions, sounds like it could be more agreeable. And then they have the domain of judging and perceiving. And what do you see in that one? Judges tend to be organized and prepared, like to make and stick to plans, comfortable following rules. What does that sound like?
Submission.
Interesting. That is very interesting. I will have to go think about that. I think it is picking up on, yeah, following most rules, definitely. There might be a mix of things in there. I do see conscientiousness there and being organized and prepared versus acting spontaneously and being flexible. So it will give you, the test will force you to be either an E or an I. That's a problem because what do we know about normally distributed variables? And in reality, extroversion is it's like a continuum. Well, most people fall in the middle, but it assumes a kind of bimodal distribution and forces you to be one or the other. So your report might not make sense to you if it's telling you that you're an extrovert and you're actually in the middle. And that's where most people are. But some of you are strong extroverts or strong introverts. And then you'll be like, oh, wow, that might make a lot of sense to you. This is missing missing something, and you mentioned it. You said that it had the turbulent thing. So that reflects the big 5 domain of emotional stability or neuroticism. So these create 16 different personalities. Okay. And I got ENTP, and I can see how it kind of, it picked up this idea of liking to argue, right? Some people don't like arguments. They don't like conflict. Other people join the debate team in high school because arguing is fun for them. That's a personality difference. And the big 5 would pick that up as disagreeableness. The test that is used, so some tests are more reliable than others. Some test questions are written better than others. And the MBTI does not have a very reliable instrument. So you can see what they're trying to pick up there, that they're trying to pick up extroversion with those questions. You regularly make new friends. Let's say you're an extrovert and you're spending all your time hanging out with your friend group, which is established. You don't need any more friends. So you might answer no, and it's going to type you as an introvert. See the problem? If you are an introvert or an extrovert, you already know that. You don't need a test score to tell you that. And so one thing you can do is just type yourself. So you might be given a type by that system. It'll say you are an ENFP, and you'd be like, no, actually, I know that I'm an introvert. and then go look at that one. So this is commonly used in workplaces for team development, and there's a very important reason for that. And it's the reason you can't use the big five, which is a scientifically validated one. And it's because all the reports are flattering. You go into a workplace in a team setting, you can't tell somebody, okay, so I think the problem is that you're disagreeable, low in conscientiousness, and neurotic. Well, that's not going to work. And so we use the MBTI instead because it reflects a lot of the big five stuff, but all the reports are flattering. And then these help people talk about differences. They help them start to appreciate differences. You know, that people who are very different from us do make important contributions. That argumentative person is also a critical thinker. Okay? And we know that teams with a lot of harmony can make bad decisions. Overall, it's not scientifically supported, even though they say it is. The research that supports it is funded or published by the company that sells it. It is now 2:15, and I'll wrap up the rest of the lecture and send it out to you. Thank you for your attention. I'll see you on Thursday. Psychodynamic personality theories are limited because they're based on dysfunction. Consider that Freud based his universal theories of personality on his neurotic clients. They were going to see him because something was very wrong. Now, Abraham Maslow did the exact opposite. He based his theories on people that were doing well, people that were thriving. Those were the Blackfoot people in the 1930s, in his estimation. Humanistic theories are different and notable because they're based on what makes people thrive, and they connect with the good and try to develop the best in people. Maslow developed his theories on autobiographies of people he admired, say Abraham Lincoln. He would look at that person and say, that's a self-actualized person, and look at the traits of people like that. So there's going to be some capacity for bias and for subjectivity and for research there too. The groups or the people that Maslow selected to base his theories on were people that he liked and admired and approved of, and that tells you something about him and his values. Imagine if he admired Donald Trump and Trump's traits went into his definition of a self-actualized person. It would look different then. Carl Rogers looked at well-being, or the lack of it, as the gap between your actual and your ideal self. And he wondered what kind of environments help people flourish so that they could become closer to that person. And Carl Rogers wouldn't give people psychometric tests, like tests for anxiety or depression. He would base it on that sense of what is the difference between where they are and what they can achieve. So what is the kind of environment that helps people flourish? Carl Rogers would have said that it's one that shows genuineness, acceptance, empathy, and unconditional positive regard for the person. This is the old slide from week 2 on history, and that is a great example of a bad slide. Look at all the shit on that slide. Carl Rogers originated person-centered approaches, so client-centered psychotherapy, student-centered classrooms, and also psychotherapy as talk therapy. Talking to the other person like they're a human, not seeing them as sick or broken, but using psychology to help them change, overcome problems, be happier, to be better adapted. So what do these self-actualized people look like? In Maslow's opinion, and now this is opinion and it's subjective, they're self-aware, self-accepting, open and curious, ready for growth and new experiences, spontaneous, loving and caring, not paralyzed by other people's opinions. He wrote that they'd acquired enough courage to be unpopular, tolerant of uncertainty, having a secure self-concept, a sense of calling where they can focus on doing good work instead of on themselves, And he thought that they experienced something that he called spiritual peak experiences, feelings of unity and universal humanity. Humanistic theories are rooted in the idea that people are fundamentally good. Unconditional positive regard can work very well in a protected, controlled therapeutic setting between a counselor and a client, in which the counselor shows unconditional positive regard for the client. However, that might not be adaptive outside of that setting. It might not be the most adaptive worldview to take with you when you go out into your cutthroat workplace. Humanistic personality theories don't have a good understanding of evil, which is real. Thanatos is missing. Now let's move on to our most scientifically validated personality theories and tools. We don't have to think of personality as being type-based. There's 9 different types of people or 12 different types of people. Instead, we could see people as having different traits, and you could be low on this trait and average on another trait and very high on some other trait. Think of all the words in a dictionary that you could use to describe a person. Gordon Allport found that there were about 18,000 words that could describe people in a dictionary. You could imagine that a lot of these words have overlap, right? Let's say nice is a word and nasty is a word. Well, maybe those two things reflect the same thing, one bigger construct, one bigger factor of agreeableness. And maybe that goes along with words like helpful or generous or mischievous. So we can start clumping some of these words together. Right? Those 18,000 words aren't all completely unique from each other. Okay? Lots of them cluster. If we say that somebody is friendly, outgoing, chatty, gregarious, well, are we talking about 3 things, or is there one bigger factor behind that? Well, we might call that extroversion. And maybe a person described as quiet, shy, inhibited, retiring is somebody we'd call an introvert. We can cluster some of these words into higher order themes. The first 2 factors that were identified by Eysenck are extroversion and neuroticism. So extroversion versus introversion and neuroticism versus emotional stability. Those factors have a strong genetic or biological basis. Unstable versus stable moods are about how reactive your nervous system is to stress. Some people are just a lot more reactive. Some people are the cranky baby, not the chill baby. We tend to stay that way through our lives. For a person high in neuroticism, the same amount of stressful stimulus will hit them harder. Per unit of that stimulus, they experience more stress. It upsets them more. They are more sensitive to it. Introversion versus extroversion is about how much stimulation you need. Remember, we learned from that Yerkes-Dodson law that there's a place that is the optimum amount of stimulation. And if you are set Goldilocks just about right, then maybe you fall in the middle of that continuum. And you don't need to either go out and get more stimulation like an extrovert would, or stay home, recharge your batteries, and recover from all that stimulation like an introvert would. So introversion versus extroversion is about sensitivity to the environment and sensitivity to overwhelm versus actually needing to seek that out. Brain activity scans of extroverts indicate that they seek stimulation because their normal baseline brain arousal is relative to other people, it's relatively low. Extroverts also have more dopamine-related neural activity, and dopamine is a neurotransmitter that's associated with pleasure. helps us strive and focus and find things interesting. And a lot of these words sound kind of warm and happy. So extroverts are chronically cognitively understimulated, need to go out and get out and stir things up. And if they were to stay at home, they might feel a little depressed. Introversion is often misunderstood as shyness, but introverted people often simply seek low or lower levels of stimulation from their environment. They're chronically overstimulated. Lemon tastes more sour to introverts. They salivate more to that same stimulus. So a good extroversion versus introversion question might be, are you energized by being around other people and all their ruckus and problems? Do you want to go study in the cafeteria? Or are you energized by quieter settings? Do you rather read alone in the library? There are actually more than 2 dimensions, and research supports 5. The most validated theory of personality, and please don't think that means it's like the law of gravity, is Costa McCrae's 5-factor model. And each of those factors has subfacets. These are traits that tend to cluster together in people who are high on the given factor. So let's start with neuroticism. Right? As you know, a person high in neuroticism is hit harder per unit of a stressful stimulus. They experience more anxiety, more anger, more depression, more impulsive, they're more self-conscious and more vulnerable. It takes less to destabilize them. Then there's openness. And people who are very high on openness, we would expect to also be high on imagination, artistic appreciation, attentiveness to their inner feelings, adventurousness in the sense of going out there to find new things that they're open to. They're curious, and they challenge authority because they're open to the idea that the authority is wrong. Other people might not question that, but they would. Conscientiousness is about a detail orientation, competence, order, dutifulness, achievement striving, self-discipline, and deliberation, which means thinking before you act. I have the university logo there, and that's because our motto is Age quod agis. What does that mean? Well, it means do what you do. Do what you do well. Do it rightly, seriously, thoroughly, to the best of your ability. It means, I have it written up on the whiteboard here, concentrate on one responsible task at a time. Do not scatter your moral forces. Ignatius of Loyola, who's the namesake of the Loyola building, taught that satisfaction came from doing work that serves the highest good. And if your work is to be of good service, then it must be done well. And there's extroversion. And our chronically understimulated extroverts are active, sensation-seeking, the type of person that goes bungee jumping because it's fun. And they are friendly, gregarious, tend to be assertive, and it's also associated with those dopaminergic states of positive emotion and warmth. Warmth as in seeking intimacy with others, instead of maybe an introvert might be overwhelmed by all of somebody's personal issues, but the extrovert would be interested. People who are agreeable show trust, altruism, compliance, modesty, and tender-mindedness. They care about your feelings. They're also considered honest. And I'm going to come back to that when we look at disagreeableness versus agreeableness as a potential reflection of dominant versus submissive traits. Consider this as from the perspective of the dominant party. The submissive person trusts them, should be honest with them, shouldn't lie to them, should be compliant, modest, and is the one that seeks to please and to appease. One of the reasons that we can't use the 5-factor model in workplaces is that some of these traits are seen as more socially desirable than others. So just look at this graph here from your textbook. Extroverts are outgoing, fun-loving, and energetic, and introverts are solitary, sober, reserved. Does one of those sound better than the other? Well, arguably, our society does privilege extroverts. People high on openness are called curious, imaginative, and independent. I don't think closed-minded, practical, and conforming sounds quite so good. High conscientiousness sounds good. Efficient, organized, and careful. Versus impulsive, disorganized, and careless. Now, the MBTI would approach this differently, and it would say that a perceiver is flexible and spontaneous. Framing matters. Let's look at agreeableness. Agreeableness sounds good. Friendly, trusting, compassionate. Disagreeableness doesn't sound so good. Antagonistic, suspicious, uncooperative. What that means is that a disagreeable person will argue, they'll be blunt, they'll say what they think is true, they'll join that debating team. They are not credulous. They tend to be critical thinkers. Is that suspicious? Absolutely. And they do tend to be competitive. Competition has its place in life. They think they can win. But uncooperative is a negative way of framing that. Let's look at neuroticism. People high in neuroticism are neurotic, anxious, insecure. That doesn't sound so good. Whereas people low in neuroticism are called calm, confident, and secure. Is one of those better than the others? Some psychologists would say that emotional sensitivity in the term of neuroticism is very adaptive when it comes to taking care of infants, because you're very aware of threats, and infants are very fragile. Here's another figure from your textbook. So low on openness is described as practical, prefers routine, and conforming. That's okay. That doesn't sound like it has too much value judgment going on there. And then high openness is described as imaginative, prefers variety, and independent. Now, low conscientiousness doesn't sound so good. Disorganized, careless, and impulsive. What else? Low agreeableness, ruthless, suspicious, and uncooperative. Ruthless. What does ruthless mean? Well, some people might not make decisions that are based on your feelings. They wouldn't be based on pleasing you or making you feel good, but they might have a valid reason for thinking that's the right decision. Maybe a soft-hearted person would be drawn in by the pull of emotions and not make the right decision. People high on neuroticism are described as anxious, insecure, and self-pitying. I hear a value judgment there. This is how scores look like on the Big Five. So this person is pretty high in extroversion, average on openness, below average on conscientiousness. They're very agreeable and very emotionally stable. These represent percentile scores. This is a norm-based test. So falling in the middle of the openness distribution means that 50% of people who took the test, that's our reference. It's not all of humanity, though we kind of want to think that it is. It's of all the people who took the test. Okay, 50% of all the people who took the test are less open than this person. And about 50% are more open. So that puts them in the middle. And these variables tend to be normally distributed, and most people will fall in the middle. Falling on the 10th percentile for neuroticism means that 10% of people who took the test are even less neurotic than this person. This is low neuroticism. And 90% of people are more neurotic. So it means that this person is relative to other people who took the test, very emotionally stable. This is what your Star Wars test results might have looked like. That is a measure of the Big Five, so it is our scientifically validated measure, and it shows percentile scores. Please ignore the whole Star Wars thing. It is clickbait. The researchers used that to get people to take the test and share it around so that there was a bigger base of people who took the test to calculate those norms on. Though it does make me wonder if there's any sample bias. Like, what if the people who took this test and shared it around are Star Wars nerds? So what I will do is send you a link to another version of the Big Five from Open Psychometrics, and it's on a slightly different sample. And if you get different results and they resonate more with you, you might want to go with that one for the assignment. The reason I used this one is because I was hoping to throw you off when I asked you which one do you think is pseudoscience, and I thought the Star Wars stuff would mess you up. Behavior is ultimately influenced by the interaction of our inner disposition with our environment. Both person and environment always matter. We can't lose sight of that. In general, our personality traits are stable. We do tend to develop in a socially desirable direction. So as people get older, they do tend to get more agreeable and less neurotic. But overall, it's pretty stable throughout your life. And personality does predict outcomes. Right? It is a predictor of mortality. So conscientiousness in combination with intelligence is an excellent predictor of job performance. Now, when I say that this is a scientifically validated model, please don't go think it's the law of gravity. Its predictive validity is still pretty weak. I went and looked up some research on personality, and I wanted to find a study where they used personality measured by the Big Five to predict some outcome. And then I looked for something we learned about in week 2, and that was the R-squared. So what is the percentage of variance of what's going on in the outcome variable that they were measuring that is predicted by personality as measured by this test from your model? And well, it was 15%. And that is great. That's pretty high in psychology. But it means that 85% of the variance in the outcome variable was not predicted by personality. It was caused by something else. It's really hard to predict from personality how somebody's going to act in a specific situation. So let's say you're an extrovert, and I think that when I see you next in class, you're going to be raising your hand and answering my questions. But you don't. Why is that? And it could be so many reasons. Maybe it's because you need to use class time to work on something else. It's better to think of personality as predicting an average behavior. Across most situations, I can expect that you will be chatty and friendly and engaged. And let's not forget that immediate situations can powerfully influence a person's behavior. And we talked about strong situations in the unit on social psychology. So there's some situations where you have to do what's expected, and your behavior is less driven by your personality or your attitudes. Personality traits do influence our behavior, but so do a lot of other things, like the way we think, the environment that we're in. What have we seen other people doing? What have we been taught to do through, say, social scripts or operant conditioning? We adjust our behavior to imitate the models that we admire and respond to the rewards and punishments delivered by the more powerful people around us. So let's say that a person is presented with a decision to go bungee jumping. What are they going to do? You know they're an extrovert, so maybe they're sensation-seeking and willing to take the risk. But there's so many other things. What happened to them in the past? What if they had been injured in an accident? Now they don't want to do that. What about external factors? Is someone paying them to do this? Are all your friends doing it? There is an interesting reciprocal interaction where personality traits determine who your friends are. So maybe you do something because your friends are doing it, but you picked your friends and you have things in common with them. Personalities shape how people interpret and react to events. If you're high on neuroticism, you might think, that was awful. But if you're more emotionally stable, you're like, yeah, whatever. Personalities help create the situations to which people react. This is at the heart of the idea of reciprocal determinism. There's an interaction and a mutual influence of behavior, internal personal factors, and environmental factors. That is a social cognitive perception of the self. Our predictions are often wrong. You know, we have these TV shows like America's Next Top Model, and they go through all these tests, and they're all interviewed before they come on the show. And there's all this work to decide who's going to be America's Next Top Model. And how often has it happened that the person that wins actually ever becomes America's Next Top Model? I don't know that it has ever happened. The single strongest predictor of someone's future behavior, if you could only have one, is their past behavior in a similar situation. Now, that's not perfect. People can and do change. I like to think that presented with the same kind of situations 10 years ago, I would react better and differently now. But it is the strongest overall predictor. So the best predictor of your grade in this class is your past grade in similar courses. And it's for this reason that it probably won't work when you try again with your ex. So maybe the best way to predict someone's job performance isn't with a personality test. It might be in a simulation of being in that job. See what they do. That's called a realistic job interview. That brings me to the end of this lecture. I welcome your questions, comments, critiques, or concerns. And next class, we'll be covering modules 47, 48, and 49 to discuss mental health and mental illness with a focus on mood disorders. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you on Thursday.